for people who are facing the situation for which apocalypses are written, which is persecution and great suffering, the news that the end is nigh is exactly what they want to hear.
I'm Pierce Hibbs, Senior Writer and Communications Specialist for Westminster Theological Seminary, and I'm here with Dr. Iain Duguid, Professor of Old Testament, and we're here to talk about when the world is going to end. Now, I'll start with an anecdote. When I first came to Westminster, I remember driving up the street to the stoplight and hearing on the radio someone saying that an evangelist had just predicted the world's end, which happened to be that day. And obviously the world had not ended. And interviewing this evangelist, they said, well, what happened with your prediction? And he said, well, the world did end. It just ended spiritually. And I remember laughing and not knowing really what that meant. But it did bring up this kind of perennial fascination with predicting the world's end. What do you think is behind the fascination with that?
Well, part of that is good. You know, people believe that the world is going to end, as the Bible tells us, that Jesus is going to return, there are new heavens and a new earth. So there's something that's good behind that. But it also gets off track because people want to know when that world is going to end and try to and either ignore or reinterpret Jesus saying that no one knows the day or the hour when Christ is coming back again.
Now, the type of literature that many people often base their predictions on, we call apocalyptic literature. It includes books like Daniel and Ezekiel and Revelation. What would be the harm in using those books to try to predict the world's end? Is there a sense in which people who do that are misreading them or misusing them?
Yeah, people often read those books as if their message was the end is nigh, and then they try to work back and calculate, well, exactly when is the end going to be nigh. But if you think about most of the readers of those books during most of the history of the church, and even before the church in terms of Old Testament books, the message for them was not the end is nigh. And in fact, for people who are facing the situation for which apocalypses are written, which is persecution and great suffering, the news that the end is nigh is exactly what they want to hear. It becomes challenging if the end is not yet nigh. You know, if your friends and your family members are being taken out and burned or killed in a variety of ways, and your land is overrun and you're living in danger of your life, you'd be very happy to hear that Jesus is coming back tomorrow. The challenge, which is the challenge that these books are written to address, is, well, how do I live if the Lord doesn't come back right away? How do I stay faithful in the midst of a world where the propagandists of this world order are saying resistance is useless, you will be assimilated, you might as well just give up, come over to the dark side. Apocalyptic says, no, there is an end coming. And God is sovereign over all these things. And it's worthwhile being faithful to the very end.
So there's a sense of comfort, even inspiration, that people can get from apocalyptic literature.
Absolutely. It's written to encourage and strengthen people who are facing the end of their lives, the end of their worlds. But if you look at the book of Daniel, for example, in Daniel 9, Daniel is thinking that the end of the world is coming soon. He's been studying Jeremiah and reading about the 70 years of the exile, and he's thinking, boy, this exile that I'm in Babylon, I've been here for nearly 70 years now. Surely it's time. The kingdom of the Babylonians is over. The Medes and the Persians have taken over. Surely it's time now for all of those great and glorious promises of Isaiah to be fulfilled. And in Daniel 9, he discovers, well, wait a minute, it's not just 70 years, it's 70 times 7. There's a much longer time scale before God will complete his work of putting an end to iniquity and transgression and sin.
Now, in contemporary culture, there seems to be either an overemphasis on apocalyptic literature and maybe an unhealthy interest in predicting the world's end. And then on the other side of the spectrum, there are those who really don't pay attention to apocalyptic literature. How can people be striking a balance and actually getting the right balance, in terms of getting the whole message of Scripture, the right balance of apocalyptic literature that has an effect on their faith?
Yeah, when I lived in Southern California, there was one Christian radio station that it seemed that all of their teaching either came from Revelation or Daniel or Ezekiel, and they were majoring on those books. And yet in Reformed circles, often we haven't spent a lot of time on those. Reformed preachers have not spent 13 years in Revelation the way they spend 13 years in Romans. We've focused much more on doctrinal texts that shape our theology and that instruct us how we should live as Christians. And perhaps that's in part because often we've been in more comfortable circumstances. When you live in a world where you actually be quite happy for the Lord to wait a few years because life is good. You just got married, you just had kids. Then apocalyptic seems very distant. But if you're part of the persecuted church, then apocalyptic feels very relevant because it is that word of comfort and encouragement, exhortation, that yes, you're on the right side and that your side wins in the end.
Now, the persecuted church, could hear a message like something from Daniel or Revelation and feel greatly encouraged or inspired. The same message might be received completely differently in the West when people are in a more comfortable situation. Do you think that there's a sense in which people in the West are missing an area of spiritual growth because they're not able to receive that message of the good news of things coming to a climax and an end?
Yeah, I think we become very focused on this world. And so we hear messages on Jeremiah 29:11 that we should seek the shalom, the peace of the city where God has placed us, which is, of course, part of the biblical message. And that becomes central to us. And so we talk about transforming society and culture and all the rest of it. And again, that's an important part of the biblical message. But what that often misses out is this sense of urgency and imminency of the Lord's return. Jesus spoke a number of parables, the focus of which was the master's on a journey and he's coming back and you better be ready. And I think we lose that sometimes when we're so concerned that we know better than to predict the end of the world. We end up predicting the non-end of the world. That, well, we don't know when it's going to happen, but it's not going to happen anytime soon, surely. And the result is that we can lose some of the urgency for evangelism, some of the urgency for our own Christian lives that we ought to have.
When we confront people who have a very different view from our own, or maybe they're very interested in predicting the world's end, they may have some biblical value that they're actually protecting, they're trying to defend or support. What are some of the values that they might be protecting, and how can we encourage them in a positive way?
Yeah, the importance of heaven and thinking about heaven. The white robes over yonder, the songs associated with this movement. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. So the importance of being right with God, knowing that you're right with God right now, not putting that off, not waiting, saying, oh, I've got plenty of time to think about these things when I'm older. The importance of missions. The world needs to hear, and we don't have an unlimited time to spread the gospel. And the importance of holiness in the Christian life, that at any moment Christ could return. And are you ready for that?
For those of us who are approached or maybe have family members or friends who are adamant world end predictors, how do we engage with them in a loving way?
I think it's important for us to understand that a lot of the Old Testament prophecies that are fulfilled in the New Testament would not have been immediately transparent ahead of time. In terms of how is the Christ going to come? Is the Christ going to be born of a virgin? Is he going to be crucified? From the perspective of hindsight, we can see how those things are prophesied in the Old Testament. But in the year 100 BC, when you got the whole Old Testament, it would not have been self-evident to people that those things were true. Some things were self-evident. When Christ comes, he's going to be born in Bethlehem. Everybody agreed on that. Other things could only really be seen with the benefit of hindsight. And so we need to have a humility when we read prophecy. That it's not clear and straightforward the way the words of Moses are in Numbers 12, 6-8. It's riddles, it's visions, it's dreams, as Numbers 12 tells us, which means that it's challenging to understand. Daniel repeatedly says, I didn't understand. I don't know what this is talking about. There are some things he did understand, other things he didn't. One like a son of man, a human figure coming in the clouds like a divine figure. How can you have both human and divine in one person? Daniel's mind. We can see, but he couldn't see. And so we need to hold on to the central things that are really clear, but also hold lightly to our convictions in terms of the things that will unfold one way or another, but we won't necessarily know ahead of time exactly how they're going to unfold.
I know some people are intimidated by apocalyptic literature, and the riddles and the imagery is so mysterious that they almost throw their hands up and say, there's no way I can ever understand this. So I might as well just focus my attention on a book like Romans and understand doctrine. What is a good way, a profitable way to be reading apocalyptic literature?
Yeah, I think you want to read it for the big picture. It's designed like an impressionist painting where if you focus in on the dots, then you miss the scope of the whole. So read it for the big picture, get the flow of that. Don't worry too much about what you don't understand. Focus on what is clear. And in that sense, read it like a child. Children read the book of Revelation and they get it. There's a great battle, and then God wins, and then all our tears are wiped away. I think that's the message it's trying to communicate. It's also focusing us on the importance of worship. Worship is what engages the heavenly hosts right now. And the book of Revelation is constantly cutting away from this confused and difficult battle scene on earth to this peaceful heavenly worship service in progress, as if to remind us that, yeah, here on earth we have many trials and tribulations, much that we don't understand, but there is a heavenly dimension in which the Lord is serenely seated on his throne and his forces will ultimately triumph.
You think apocalyptic literature could deepen a Christian's longing for that sort of worship, that sort of heavenly reality that we know is there way in the distance, we think, and yet we can push it aside and focus on today, and yet almost forget that what is coming there is much better than what I can even imagine here.
Right. And the reality is that even if what's happening today is good, we have no control over tomorrow. The person for whom today is good, tomorrow may find everything swept away. And in those moments, apocalyptic is going to become precious. The reality that God sees the suffering of his people, that God cares about the suffering of his people, that God has determined a time for the end of the suffering of his people, down to the day. He knows exactly when that's going to happen. And he will personally comfort his people. That's a comforting reality, even for those for whom the end of the world is not yet nigh.
That's a great way to end on comfort. So thank you, Dr. Iain Duguid. We hope that helps you with your own journey.